Good afternoon. Today is Saturday, May 25th, 2024. We are in Apalachicola, Florida, this lovely, lovely city and this lovely state. My name is Donovan Carter, representing the Sammy Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Today, my co-researchers are
Beckett Price,
Bennett Carroll,
Alexandra Leon.
And today we have the honor and pleasure of interviewing Mr.
Jeffrey Shanks.
Can you spell your name for us, please?
Sure, it's JEFFREYSHANKS.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Shanks, today. So could you start by telling us who you are and where you're from?
Sure, so I'm an archaeologist. I've been a professional archaeologist for, I guess, about 25 years now. I grew up in Pensacola, then came to Tallahassee for college and ended up staying there. Had a family there. I worked for the state of Florida as an archaeologist briefly 20 years ago at Mission San Luis in Tallahassee, which is a National Historic Landmark. Then I went to work for the National Park Service at the Southeast Archaeological Center in Tallahassee. I worked for the National Park Service for many years, probably 16, 17 years, and working all over the Southeast. Although I was with the Park Service, I actually did very little work in national parks. I ran a program called the Archaeological Assistance Program, where we provided technical assistance to other government agencies, local communities, other states. The National Park Service is the lead agency for cultural resources, including archaeology. And so that was part of our mission, is to provide assistance. And one of the reasons I'm here today is one of our partnerships that we had when I was at the National Park Service was with the U.S. Forest Service, which manages Prospect Bluff National Historic Sites. And the Heritage Program Manager for the National Forests in Florida, Dawn Lawrence, knew of my program from her time when she was previously at the Park Service. So she reached out to me, and through an interagency agreement, we ended up doing a lot of work at the site of Negro Fort at Prospect Bluff over the last several years, and doing mostly non-destructive archaeology, ground-penetrating radar. It's, the site is a very sensitive location, and from the story that I know some of you have heard, a number of people lost their lives there and are still buried out there. And so we don't do any excavations, we don't break ground out there. It's too sensitive for that. So we have to use other methods to try and recover the information about the site out there. So ground penetrating radar is a powerful tool that we use in archaeology now for that reason. And so for the last few years, my program at NPS did a lot of that work. We just started publishing it. Just recently in the last year, I did finally leave the Park Service for the private sector, doing some consulting, working for the private consultant for a while, and now I work for an engineering company, running a cultural resources program there. But I continue to not just work at Prospect Bluff, but try to tell the story of Prospect Bluff, because it's something that, to be frank, once I became involved, it just sucked me in. How could it not, right? This is such a powerful story, a story that's been erased. And archaeology can be a great tool for recovering lost stories, stories that don't make it into the history books, stories that are erased from the history books. Archaeology often gives you the ability to tell the stories of people whose stories otherwise wouldn't get told. And that's one of the things that I and Dawn Lawrence, my Forest Service colleague, have both been working hard to do over the last few years, is get this story out. But even more importantly than getting it out is reframing even how we tell the story. Within archaeology as a discipline, there's been a movement over the last few years to try and decolonize archaeology, right? Decolonize the discipline as a whole. Archaeology has a history in colonization, right? It was often, especially in its infancy over a century ago. It was about interpreting the material culture, usually Europeans interpreting the material culture of colonized peoples and reframing their history through the lens of the colonizers, right? And that's one of the things that we're trying to get away from. And that's very much something that has been done with this site. The story, I'd always heard of this site, here in Tallahassee, but the way it was always framed, it was called Fort Gadsden, which is a reference to a later American fort that was built there several years later. It was often, you would hear it referred to, oh yeah, there was this fort where, some runaway slaves went there and, were, rebelling against, right? There used to even be a sign out there near one of the cemeteries out there. They called it a renegade cemetery, right? Like that was when it was a state park years ago. So even the interpretation out there, it wasn't just dated, it was racist, like flat out racist interpretation. And so just the way the story, when it's even told, was told from the perspective of the Americans that destroyed the fort, the community that was there. It was told in a way that was that diminished the agency of the people that were there. Even as people started to tell the story in a more well-meaning way, it was still done, well, the British came here and, freed people, right? Even then it was still paternalistic in the way it was being told, right? With a white savior narrative. And one of the things that we've uncovered using the archaeology is we've shown that there wasn't just a British fort there or a later American Fort Gadsden. What the archaeology is showing is how the people that were living there when it was a free black community, and to be clear, it was probably at its time one of the largest free black communities in North America. That's not been told, right? Those people changed. They changed that British fort, turned it into their own thing, built their own fortifications that were protecting their village where they were living. They were doing their own thing there. That is the real Negro fort, right? Or Fort Negro. Even the nomenclature of this site is a story in and of itself, right? The fact that it was called Fort Gadsden for all of these years, right? And even in starting to refer to it as, or the British fort before that, even referring to it as Negro Fort, right? That was a term that was originally used derisively by the Americans that wanted to destroy it, like contemporaneously, right? It was a term meant to scare people, to scare white slave owners, right? To, evoke the boogeyman of slave revolt, right? Which is what that fear that many white slave owners had, right? So it's this, it's a Negro Fort, It was derisive at first. It's a term that has since become reclaimed to some degree, right? But even then you had, there was resistance. Even now as we're trying to retell the story, you had well-meaning white people in management, the Forest Service, we can't use the word Negro on a sign. And yet you talk to descendants, they're like, no, use the word Negro, because you know what that does? That reminds people that there were black people here. And that's the problem, right? So it was a struggle even to get that, right? But here's an interesting thing about the name, right? So what I've learned is just going into communities and telling the story and trying to get it out there. This is a story that even within the local black community is not well known, certainly among younger generations. But one of the things I did find out as I'm giving presentations and talking about the archaeology and doing all this stuff, talking especially to elders in the black community, I'd be talking about Negro Fort. Oh, you mean Fort Negro? Which is interesting, and I kept hearing this over and over again. Within the local area, there's a tradition of calling it Fort Negro as opposed to the Negro Fort, which seems like a subtle difference, but I think it's a powerful difference, right? One is an adjective, right? Describe where Negro is used as an adjective to describe something. Fort Negro, it's a proper noun, it's a name, right? Now, I don't know, we don't know for sure what they called this location themselves, we don't know. But there may be this oral tradition here, at least locally, right? And so That's, names are powerful, right? I don't know how authentic that is, right? But the terms, even the nomenclature of this site is significant, and it's worthy of discussion, right? And for me, Southern white guy, right, having to unlearn a lot of the narratives that I was taught, right? And I am. I'm learning so much, but I'm unlearning just as much, if not more, right? And having to unlearn. This has been a fascinating journey for me. It's changed how I even approach archaeology, right? One of the most important things that we're doing now as part of that effort to decolonize, right, archaeology is working with descendant communities. This is the big thing now, right? And I'm understanding after doing this now, I 100% understand why, and it's changed just even how I approach everything I do. One of the first things that we did was we knew there were some descendants that were in Trinidad. We'd heard about them and started searching for them. It was actually Dawn that found them on Facebook, found their group on Facebook of all places. And we reached out to them. Descendants that they had left the fort here before, they left with the British when they pulled out, and they were British citizens now, and so they were resettled, in British colonies. They ended up in Trinidad. And when we reached out to them, the leader of their group, Akila Jaramogi, they called themselves Americans, like Americans, but without the A, right? Americans. And that's how they were referred to in Trinidad when they showed up, like the others called them Americans, right? When they showed up in Trinidad, they, even today, still commemorate the day that they arrived in Trinidad. And they had a lot of their history, like they knew some of them came from Florida. They didn't know exactly the full story out here, right? They knew there was some connection. They didn't, but they invited us to be on a giant Zoom call with on that day that was commemorating their arrival in Trinidad. And so both Dawn and I were on that call and meeting some of these folks for the first time. And when Akila, she made a comment, she's like, it's a special time, to bring these stories together. And, one of the things she said that resonated with me, we've just been waiting for somebody to reach out to us, right? Why hadn't this been done before? From that moment on, it was, 100%. Like, let's tell us your story, They're now, Dawn worked to make them consulting parties now. With everything that's done out there, they will have a say in it, the descendants. And we managed to use I was still with the National Park Service at the time. We brought Akila, the leader of their group, made her an international NPS volunteer so that we could bring her here to be a part of our project when we were doing the GPR. And when people heard that she was coming, there were other descendants. The word got out and people just showed up. And we met Tony Mitchell, Thomas Mitchell, and learned about the Hyde Park community right here near Tallahassee that are descendants that we didn't know about. They knew who they were, right? And brought them into the fold. Like, everybody's coming together, and it was just a way to start this discourse community of descendants and historians and people working on the site and the greater community around it, to try and tell this story in a way that hadn't been told before. Tell the story from the point of view as best we can of the people who lived there, not the people who conquered it and killed people there and destroyed it, which is how it's been told all these years. So this is a large part of what we're trying to do. It's still a work in progress, making mistakes, learning from them, trying to do the best we can. The archaeology is just one tool, but it can be a powerful one. Like I said, history books are incomplete. History is written by humans, and humans have agendas, and humans can be wrong, and humans can lie, right? And the things you leave behind in the ground doesn't lie. Like your garbage doesn't lie, right? I can go through your trash can and I can tell you all kinds of things you were doing last week. That's basically what archaeology does, right? And so we can at least try to learn more about the people that lived here, right? Because we don't have any narratives really about them. All of the historic narratives are written by the Americans or the British or the Spanish, right? They're all European narratives, right? We don't have any written narratives of the people who lived here for the most part, other than snippets here and there. But there's oral histories, right? There's the archaeology. There's other tools we can use to start trying to reclaim those stories. And, that's what we're trying to do. And every time we have an event like this, there's new people that come, and this community around this site keeps growing, and the story gets richer as we get more pieces and put it together. So, it was amazing today to see so many people show up to want to hear about this story, and they're going to go back and they're going to tell other people, right? Hopefully they'll tell young people, because that's what we really need, and I'm hopeful that we find less traditional, more modern ways of interpreting this story other than history on a stick, as we like to say. Interpretive signs are great. We love them. We have 2 new interpretive signs out there that have replaced some of the older stuff out there that was, quite frankly, a little cringy. And that's good. We got to do that. We're working on an interpretive website, an educational website with the Riley House Museum in Tallahassee has applied for a grant to do a website out there. We're going to be working with an archaeologist, a colleague of mine who actually did a lot of the archaeology at Rosewood. He does 3D digital models. So he's going to be working on doing a 3D digital model of the fort to be able to recreate it so we can put that on a website. People can do walkthroughs without having to visit the physical location, which is kind of isolated. It's hard to get to, right? You put it on a website, everybody can come there and see. I'm hopeful that we can, we're working on developing curricula, school curricula and things like that. Of course, it's a challenge sometimes getting these stories in schools, especially in Florida. But, it can be done, and you can find ways to get this story out here in non-traditional ways, and I'm hopeful that we'll have some success with that. I would love to see an augmented reality version of the fort out there where you can, not just go to a website and see a 3D reconstruction, but you can visit the site and you can hold your phone up and you can see it there on the landscape, right? There's better ways we can start telling the story, but it's not just about the fort, right? It's about the people too there, right? That's, we need to start trying to do our best to reclaim the people, the stories of the people that were there. We have the names of some of the people like Garcon and Mary Ashley and Abraham, some of those names you've heard today, right? But there's many more. And we don't have complete stories about them. We don't have, full knowledge, but we have some, and we can tell what we do know. And I'm hopeful that, we can keep getting the word out and getting the story out there, because it's such a powerful story. It's a story that has not just local significance, not even just national significance, but it's an international story, and, the site itself, it has, that kind of recognition. It's a National Historic Landmark, which is the highest designation that you can get on the National Register. It's on the NPS's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. It was a significant site that people were escaping to and coming to, right? It was, incredibly important site for, as an example of resistance to enslavement. So yeah, that's been my involvement. That's what I'm trying to do. That was a long soapbox rant, but you can chop it. You can edit that and chop it up and get some good stuff from it.
Yeah, that was amazing. I mean,
right?
I had questions and then you immediately answered so many of them. I would love to hear a little bit more about how having access to this community and even like watching it grow, it meeting other community members who are descendants of Fort Negro, how has that sort of changed your methodology as you work on the site?
So I touched on that a little bit, but it's, for one thing, not just focusing on this site as a fort and thinking of it as a fort with just material remains and all of that. It's made me think more about the people that lived here. What were they doing? How were they interacting with other communities, with indigenous communities in the area, like the Miccosukee and the Creek, and how were they trading and interacting with other free black communities in Florida, of which there were many, again, whose stories are not told. Angola, was another large community down in the Tampa Bay area, and we have limited evidence, but that they were interacting, and there was trade going on back and forth all along the Gulf Coast of Florida. There were networks of communication and commerce and all of that going on here in Florida that were outside of the European sphere of influence that people were utilizing and creating and implementing in order to survive in a hostile environment, to be frank, right? But again, outside of that European sphere of influence. And so it's often not acknowledged or recognized by traditional history. And so it's maybe start focusing on these kinds of things, right? Areas that we wouldn't normally just be focusing on necessarily. And I'm doing that because it's talking to descendants and making me think more about the people than the stuff that they leave behind, right? And that's because that's what archaeology is for the most part. It's focused on the material culture that's left behind. But when I have an experience like seeing descendants come out to the site, like seeing Aquila come here where, her people had come from here 200 years before, and for the first time she's returning here, and seeing that experience of how powerful that was for her. And that emotion, and so many emotions, right? For me, it's just somebody that's used to dealing with the history and the material culture of people that lived hundreds or even thousands of years ago. I'm seeing now how what I do is affecting people that are alive today. And that's it. For me, that's life-changing this makes me approach my career and what I do in just an entirely different way. Because now it's about working with living people, with descendants. It's what I do is affecting people that are alive today. That is something very new for me as an archaeologist. And it makes you focus on the people more than the stuff they leave behind.
I think I've got one question for you, and I was kind of framing it in the lens of I think there's a lot of novelty in decolonialization, right? And that process of unlearning.
Yeah.
I think using the idea of the fort as there's the noun version and there's the verb version. What do you think the experience of attending the fort, just as any guest attending any park, what do you think the role of decolonization or that process of unlearning could teach someone that could enter the park?
Oh, that's a great question. And because this goes to how future interpretation out there, needs to be done. I don't know that I'm the right person to answer that question. I think it's the descendants that ultimately need to answer that question. How do we better tell your story here? That's why we consult, right? That's why we're doing this. I don't think that's up to me, I think that, I guess maybe I just answered it. The way to do that is to let the descendants guide how that site is interpreted. at the end of the day, I can do the archaeology. I can show, like, here's the stuff that's here. Here's what we think they were doing. Here's all of these things. But at the end of the day, this isn't my story to tell. You know, it's not my story. I can help give tools to help descendants tell their story, maybe. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's not my story. It's not the Forest Service story. You know, it's the descendant story. And so I think that's the answer is, you know, and that's what the Forest Service is doing now, doing everything in consultation with descendants, is let them help guide that process on how their story is told. That's the way to do it.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Mr. Shanks.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.